the end. As far as I understand, you have the draft. So as you can see, also the draft is in early stages, working paper. So all the comments are more than welcome. And again, thank you for helping me out. So augmented justice, that's the title of the paper. I started writing it a couple of months ago, and basically, one of the things that sparked my interest and actually motivated me to to write this paper uh, was one more mundane, and that I'm gonna talk a bit about later. But about this idea that I used to I'm writing on evidence law, and there's a bunch of literature on evidence law in which they're advocating for the use of AI to as a decision-making tool in hopes that we can devise some sort of way of obtain the most justified or epistemically justified decisions about the facts of the case. Typically, this involves some sort of probabilistic reasoning, something that we humans, without any help, are it's almost impossible for us to do on our own because we lack of this computational capacity, which is something that AI or other non-human tools might supplement or complement. And there's a lot of literature regarding the use of AI. And this literature goes about like, okay, how can we avoid some pitfalls? How can we identify those pitfalls? What are the upshots of using this sort of technology? What are some sort of like normative reasons as to why certain kinds of technologies are better than others? And how ultimately this will conform with things that we are using or that we, sorry, with goals that we want to achieve. Also, you can see this debate in political philosophy too, regarding democracy, for example. How can AI might help us, or how can AI, yeah, will help us to carry out our preferences in a more effective way, maybe removing some middlemen. Usually, this idea of some sort of just democracy plus or augmented democracy, which has to do with maybe we can use AI avatars as some sort of personal legislators that, in some sense, will kind of carry it out and formulate better our needs to the powers that be. So we try to discuss what sort of models can we use, how can we, what sort of technical pitfalls can we encounter, and how can we fix them, right? And there is this idea that using AI for high stake decision making is kind of like frowned upon, or not frowned upon. I mean, I feel like there is this underlying worry, which is kind of interesting because us as a species, we try to do things better than we do before. So we develop new technologies, we develop techniques to make everything faster, I don't know, aesthetically like more beautiful, long lasting, easier and cheaper to produce, etc., etc. So, in principle, we don't have much of a problem in devising tools to do things better than we used to do it before we devise those tools. But when it comes to AI and high decision make or high stakes decision making, we tend to have some sort of problem and kind of like this idea and this worry. So the paper starts with this idea of the fallibility argument, right? Most of the objections against the use of AI for decision making will come with this. Well, AI has a lot of problems in the sense of like it's flawed its decision making process, right? It makes mistakes. So insofar AI is fallible, then we should not use it. So that's what I call the fallibility argument. Sorry, I wanna double check. Can you hear me properly, right? There is no. Okay, good. Thank you, Victor. So you have this fallibility argument that I buy. That is like if AI is fallible, then we should not use it, right? I concede this from the get-go. Of course, this also calling to attention that maybe this formulation is quite strong because presumably we also have human decision-making process is also fallible. So it should also cover or the fallibility argument should also cover human reasoning, right? But it seems that there is something special about AI or fallible AI that will make this decision of not using it for high decision making or high stakes decision making, such as adjudication, justified, right? So I thought I started thinking like, okay, if the fallibility argument is good enough, then are there any other sort of arguments that does not rely on the fallibility argument that might help us to reject or justify a rejection of AI as a decision-making tool? So if that's the case, then we need to be in a situation, or we need to put ourselves in a situation in which we have an infallible AI or a nearly infallible AI, right? So if there is if there is a infallible AI or a nearly infallible AI, do we actually have very good reasons to not use it as a decision-making tool? And this is kind of the idea of the paper. I'm trying to figure out like why, in cases in which might have an infallible AI, we also might have good reasons not to use it, right? So this is I called in the, now that I'm being developing more a bit the argument. I try to pose these objections from the standpoint of what I call the detractors, right? The detractors are this set of people, a group of people that will try to find objections against the use of AI in cases in which this AI is infallible or nearly infallible. And I call this nearly infallible AI augmented justice, right? So that's the idea. But I also, from the outset, I kind of realized that all these objections seems to also be applicable to human decision making. So suddenly the detractors face a dilemma, which I call, surprise, surprise, the detractors dilemma, right? So either we stand by your arguments, but we pay the price of saying like, yeah, but our arguments or objections are also uh, can also be deployed against human courts or human decision making, even someone might say even in a stronger fashion. Or the other horn of the dilemma would be, well, we actually do not have good arguments to reject AI, and we might have some worries, like some worries, some that what might be attached to some religious belief, to some sort of intuitive quizziness, but nothing that you can actually say, okay, I'm gonna use it to put together an argumentative system that I can deploy against this sort of use of AI, right? And this is the more mundane and I think the more interesting part of as to how the paper came to be, right? I was watching Jurassic Park 1. I know that some of us are old enough to remember the first Jurassic Park. Most of you maybe not. But there is this beautiful scene in Jurassic Park in which you have John Hammond, which is the owner. He's having lunch with the lawyer and Ian Malcolm, portrayed by Jeff Goldblum, and this scientific. He was a chaos mathematician, right? And John Hammond and the lawyer, they are super happy about the park and the technology that they have developed, and they are just basically patting themselves on the back, saying like, "Oh my God, look what we have done! This is amazing!" And the lawyer was saying like, "Yeah, and we can charge a lot of money. So imagine how much we can charge for the tickets." And then Hammond was like, "Okay, it's not about the money; it's also about the technology; it's also about everything." And then at some point, Malcolm intervenes and he says something on the likes like, "The lack of humility that I see, the lack of humility against nature that I see displayed on this table is staggering." And then Hammond and the lawyer, they look at him and they were like, "Okay, but what's your problem? I mean, look, no one can ever dream of what we have been doing." And then Malcolm starts with this beautiful monologue, and part of and on one part of the monologue, it says this thing like your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should, right? And that struck me like, oh, this is a lot like AI, right? And a lot of like the literature, moreover, at least the legal philosophical literature on AI, in which we're just trying to think how can we use AI, how can we improve it, how can we identify the pitfalls, how can it will maximize certain things that we are already doing, but there is very little about the should or the shouldness of AI, except for some ethics of AI, but ethics of AI mostly deals with already specific topics such as like agency, responsibility, that also presuppose that, okay, if we're going to use AI, then we need to start thinking about these other topics. But this paper tried to bring it, it's like, okay, but wait a minute, there is something that we need to, before the if, we need to try to figure out whether we should. And all these objections that the detractors will try to deploy, they try to tackle this idea of should, right? So the scenario is that augmented justice, which is this infallible or nearly infallible AI, is way better than us. We know it by default. Now, uh, if typically we accept and we use things that will improve our practices, why are we so reticent as to deploy something that is clearly better than us, right? So the content of the presentation, very, very succinct, is the worry, the solution. I'm going to talk about Hercules and Plato, the objections, and then some final remarks. And I hope everything fits neatly in half an hour. Well, I already started talking a bit too much, but I trust that some of you will flag if I'm going overboard. So the problem, this is something that we already discussed. Like, I mean, the typical view is like judges are they are weak spots in the administration of justice. Among other things, they can be bribed, they are biases, they have systemic shortcomings, that they get tired and need to rest. They have computational limitations. Sometimes have vested interest in the outcome, right? They need to please either their superiors or other people that they might be bankrolling. Victor now is aware of the Chilean political situation, and then we have seen that okay, might be judges, and maybe this is not also privy only to Chilean the political landscape, but judges are like they need to answer to some other interest, right? They also have political allegiances. They have this value preference that we are kind of unsure whether they are just their private morality or they are actually a reflection of some sort of higher and objective or critical morality and so on, right? So all these reasons, like all this like standard picture of the weak spot, let's say the weak spot picture, whether they are valid or not, they're justified or not, they kind of invite us to reflect that it might be better that the administration of justice might be carried out better by a non-human judge. In this case, this artificial intelligence, right? And the solution is the Augmented Justice Program, which is an AI-driven initiative aiming at replacing courts with AI adjudicators, right? So the augmented justice program, I try to describe it a bit. I'm trying to create this setting, this scenario in which it's a very powerful LLM and LRM that train personalized avatars from human judges that can act either as one adjudicators or as an outsource of legal reasoning, providing human judges with solutions to individual cases, right? The avatars can map out the preference, backgrounds, and past decisions of their human counterparts and combine them with access to legal databases and the vast array of relevant academic knowledge produced to this day. So this is kind of like the fun part. It's not that the avatars not only have access to to all like the legal materials themselves, but also to books of philosophy, of political science, of legal philosophy. And in that scenario, it's also the knowledge keeps updating insofar those other sources also keeps updating, right? So they keep having like this access to all books and all sources on different sources of relevant knowledge. Right? And in this scenario, the avatars are both deliberative and dialogical. They are deliberative in the sense that they are able to deliberate among themselves, right, and try to figure out the best solution by kind of testing their different options justified in all this vast array of knowledge, but also they are dialogical in the sense that they also talk or they are able to converse with their human counterparts in order to map out their own backgrounds, right? We don't want just to in some sense it is kind of important, this idea of some sort of the human factor, but not in the sense of like with the limitations that human has, but we do believe that certain idiosyncratic aspects might play a role in legal decision making combined with all the vast knowledge, right? So it's basically what we have but better, right? The judges but better. So remove the weak spots, but also keep this side of like some sort of human psychology there. Of course, refine, let's call it human psychology 2.0 or something like that, right? And I said that it's nearly infallible or infallible AI in a sense that what does that mean, right? So what this might be some sort of controversial point, but which I don't think so actually. I mean, it is uncommon, or sorry, it's commonly in the literature you're gonna find when we're talking about correctness of decision making or the justice of a decision, we are thinking on two conditions, at least two necessary conditions. One is that there must be an effect of a certain mean of truth of the disputed questions of fact. For some, that means that whatever we say that has been proven is true or it has happened, or for others, it's like, well, it needs to be justified up until the level required by the legal system, right? I mean, the standard of proof will tell you what is the level of evidentiary sufficiency, and if we're able to arrive to this evidentiary sufficiency level, then we might say that something has been proven. But also, this is some sort of fictionalism in the sense that something that has proven, we have the fiction that also happened, right? So presumably, if the standard of proof is very high, then there are higher chances that what we say that has been proven has obtained, right? And the thing is, with AI, we can actually get that, right? Imagine all this discussion, the standards of proof are probabilistic thresholds, and they say, well, a hypothesis of conviction can only be proven if it has a probability of more than 90% or more than 0.9. AI can actually carry out the calculus, right? Unlike us. So the decisions will be highly justified, following whatever the criteria of justification the legal system contains. And I'm using this fiction also that proven means that obtained. This also could be something that we can discuss about that. But I think that our legal practice tends to intuitively uh, stand behind some sort of fictionalism regarding the evidence of the proven hypothesis or the proven hypothesis, right? And then we have the correct interpretation of the relevant sources of law, which does not mean that there is a right answer to every interpretative question. It just means that there is a correct answer. What does correctness means? Well, in this case, correctness means that the ascription, that the meaning ascribed to a norm formulation is in some sense derived or infer from the use of the interpretative directives provided by the legal system, and of course the justification in terms of explanatory justification as to how this use it's able to justify this meaning, right? So correctness here, I guess for some of you might be familiarized with Oliver Krona's distinction between truth and correctness, in which correctness is just simply the accommodation to a set of rules, right? So whatever result or whatever action we would like to follow, it cannot it cannot come from wherever, but actually needs to be grounded in a set of rules. So in this case, the meaning of the text can be any meaning insofar it can be justified in explanatory terms. From the grounding on these interpretative directives, right? So augmented justice excels in both accounts. And also it does it like continuously, right? So in this scenario, decisions about facts typically correspond with reality and are always epistemically justified. The interpretation of the law typically yields correct results. So if you have, you have a question, a good decision or a justified decision at the level of questions of fact and also the questions of law, then you have a just decision. This is Bentham, this is Tarufo, this is Well, a bunch of everyone in between, right? This idea that necessary conditions for the justice of a decision making requires correct interpretation and also epistemically justified decisions of facts, right? Um, so, so augmented justice is able to provide you that, right? And I also have um, two ways in which, let's say, when you have Amazon, you can get Amazon Prime and stuff like that. Like in this case, you can buy Hercules or you can buy Plato. Like your government will buy one of these initiatives. So Hercules provides a legal system with authoritative decisions along with their justification. So legal systems that adopt Hercules will effectively replace human adjudicators with AI adjudicators. And the Plato Initiative provides legal system with recommended decisions and their justification, right? So legal systems that adopt Plato will effectively outsource legal reasoning. Human adjudicators can either accept or reject Plato's recommendations. However, if they opt for rejection, courts ought to provide grounds for the decision to do so. So immediately we place the judge in a very difficult position because how are you going to justify rejecting the decision based or that is the end result of the modulation of a vast array of knowledge, such as the one that Plato has access to, right? Adjudicative decisions carried out by augmented justice are grounded on true descriptions of facts and the correct interpretation of the legal rules. Decisions also enjoy a sufficient degree of justification, articulating clearly the reasons that support both the questions of fact and the questions of law. We also know that unlike human courts, Hercules and Plato continuously produce just these decisions over time. Right, so this is the scenario, right? We have this problem in which human courts are quite ineffective, or not quite ineffective, but more fallible than we would like. And then comes augmented justice and say like, hey, I can give you almost nearly infallible justice, right? And I go through it, and you will know how we get arrive to the decisions of fact, how we arrive to the decisions of law. It's super clear. Everyone can follow it. We're gonna get it right almost all the time, if not all the time. So would we go for it? And here's where the detractors, and here's where us, I would say, the detractors, it's some sort of representation of our human worries, say like, maybe wait a minute, we need to kind of think about this, and maybe there we have a set of good reasons for not going about it, right? And when I was developing this part, I was thinking about what kind of objections we might advance. And I came to, this is not an exhaustive list of course. I actually had a bit more, but I wasn't sure whether they are as strong as these ones. So I have objections from legitimacy, from morality, what I call the BBB objection. So it's the black box and bias, and then accountability. So legitimacy, we can say, I mean, the detractors might say, oh, well, wait a minute. Okay, you might be infallible, but doesn't mean that you are legitimate, right? Legitimacy in this very general sense of like the good reasons to accept, in this case, this decision, right? So that could be if the objection is successful, then it could actually be a good reason to not opt for augmented justice. But of course, one would like to know, what do you mean by legitimacy, right? So now the detractors need to explain. They cannot just say, play a card and say legitimacy. They need to actually explain to you what does legitimacy means in this context, right? And suddenly, now we have a bit of a problem because legitimacy is a ambiguous term, right? So it could be political legitimacy in terms of political will, democratic legitimacy. It could be some sort of consent in terms of the classic autonomy, private law kind of consent, right? Like entering into a contract. Or some other sorts of legitimacy, such as uh, expertise, right? So we need to figure out what are the sources of legitimacy of courts, right? And when I was just writing this objection, then I kind of bumped out with a lot of people um, trying to defend the legitimacy of courts in terms of knowledge, in terms of expertise, actually. The expertise is like the know-how. How am I supposed to use the sources of law in a way that can yield justified results, right? So, So they tend to call it knowledge, some others expertise, or knowledge as expertise. So when I was reading about this, and it came up with like, okay, but okay, one source of course legitimacy might be knowledge. Courts enjoy a special epistemic status that serves as a ground for their legitimacy, but knowledge of what exactly? Courts, through their training and experience, develop expertise, right? That ultimately produces knowledge of the law. So it's not any knowledge, it's knowledge of the law. And what does that mean? Well, the knowledge of the law is the knowledge of sources of law, legal doctrines, past decision, interpretive codes, among other things, to do something with that knowledge, which is to adjudicate cases. And not just adjudicate cases, but adjudicate cases also in a way that is legitimate or just, right? We tend to use a lot of this idea of justice. Justice and the law are two concepts that are strongly and very closely connected. In many jurisdictions, we call the Supreme Court judges, we call them justices, right? Or we have the Palace of Justice and so on and so forth. So it's not just lofty vocabulary. It seems that we do believe that justice and law are connected through among other things, through the acting of courts, right? So knowledge in this sense might be equated with expertise, that is a know-how about how to adjudicate justly. And knowledge as expertise is the proper use of legal sources and relevant information to obtain just decisions. But okay, if this is true, if this is a good reconstruction of what legitimacy is, well, news flash. I mean, if you can reduce this idea of knowledge as expertise as the proper use of legal sources, well, I mean, Hercules and Plato can do it better, right? Can produce decisions by analyzing a large number of legal sources in considerably less time than their human counterparts, ensuring correct interpretation of the legal materials. Remember, this is the original presupposition that these are fallible or nearly infallible. Augmented justice can use both probability calculus and explanatory devices to determine the most epistemically justified decisions about the facts of the law. Augmented justice computational power places it in a privileged position regarding the crafting of adjudicative decisions. So if knowledge as expertise is the proper use of legal sources and the relevant information to obtain just decisions, then augmented justice exhibits this kind of knowledge, extending the scope of legitimacy to its decisions, right? So if detractors believe that, well, just a summary, believe that a ground of legitimacy of courts is it's this knowledge has know-how, then necessarily because of what I said previously, they need to extend this idea of legitimacy to AI, right? So okay, not a good answer. Then some detractors might say, well, yeah, okay. This is not done. We have some other stuff to say. We have maybe an even more powerful objection, which is like morality. I mean, moral considerations are central in our decision-making processes, adjudication being one of those processes. Humans are especially situated to obtain moral knowledge, so the knowledge of what is the right thing to do. Therefore, human courts are especially situated to apprehend what is the right thing to do when adjudicating, right? AI cannot access moral knowledge, the objection goes. Therefore, AI is not especially situated to apprehend what is the right thing to do when adjudicating, right? Of course, I'm aware that this notion of morality requires certain commitments. So you need to be a moral realist to defend this view. I am willing to concede that this might be some sort of default position. People might talk and act as if morality is real. Of course, from that doesn't follow that is real, but it's a good explanatory. The fact that morality is real is a good explanatory ground as to why we act the way we act, right? So this is the explanation argument for moral realism. And imagine that these detractors are both anti-positivists, and then also, even if they are not, they can formulate this objection as a way of legal reasoning that is compatible with one being a legal positivist too. So imagine that you're anti-positivist and you say, look, humans can access to morality, and morality and law are conceptually connected. Therefore, if you want to know what law is, you need to be able to obtain moral knowledge, right? Since humans are the only ones able to obtain moral knowledge, then humans are the only ones that are able to know what the law is. And adjudication is the application of what the law is, right? So, so yeah, augmented justice. I don't know what you're doing. It's not adjudication because adjudication necessarily requires moral knowledge. You are just doing something else, right? So it's not that you are fallible. It's just you're not doing what you're saying that you're doing, right? This is some sort of genetic argument. So from the genesis of the state of affairs, there's certain things that cannot go, right? Um, but maybe you are not an anti-positivist, right? Maybe you feel like I don't want to commit myself with this anti-positivist reading. But what I can say, and this is something that legal positivists might be comfortable with, is that yeah, when we interpret the law, moral considerations rise, right? We use moral considerations or value-based considerations, right? Whether this is means that there is need to be a moral realist. No, I mean, we can also have non-moral values, but ultimately, values are a thing in legal reasoning. So if adjudicating, if a condition for adjudication is to engage in legal reasoning, and legal reasoning supposes moral knowledge, and AI cannot uh, access to moral knowledge, then AI cannot actually do legal reasoning. They might look like legal reasoning, but it's not legal reasoning, right? So I like these two objections. I call it the champagne objections, in the sense of like, well, you cannot call it champagne unless it comes from the region of Champagne, but let's call it, I don't know, fuzzy wine, bubbly wine, whatever, and it could even be even better than champagne. So how can we answer? Well, I mean, we can answer in the following way. I mean, ultimately adjudication has to do with results, and a lot of this how to you can access to moral knowledge has to do with the procedure, right? What we would like to know is like whether I can get the same results or even better results, maybe bypassing or not necessarily with engaging moral knowledge, right? So how how can we answer to this question without us trying to fight against moral realism? So I don't want to get into a metaethical debate, or b even questioning whether anti-positivism or this particular view of legal reasoning are the correct ones in terms of like framing it. No, I mean the proponents of AI might also say the following: look, it seems that it's not the existence of morality and the access to this moral world, or sorry, it's not that the existence of morality and all the properties of moral facts. What it's the matter, it's whether we can access to something like moral knowledge, right? So let's focus on the debate on moral epistemology. This is a moral epistemology issue, right? How can we know or identify what it is required of us from morality? And from that, we need to figure out how we have posited that we can actually do it, right? And in metaethics, you have two views, the non-naturalism and naturalism. The non-naturalist view claim that we have this idea of intuition. So we access to moral knowledge via our intuitions. Or intuitions is this pre-rational capacity of access to self-evident truths, right? Now, no, it's called non-naturalism because they claim that moral facts and morality exist, but not in the same realm as us, not in this physical realm or empirical or naturalist realm, but it's in this other realm which is called the non-natural, right? So all the moral properties are in this non-natural realm, and humans have access via our intuitions. So we have some sort of things like an intuition machine apparently that is able to pick up this. These these uh, these moral facts, right? Um, but of course, non-naturalism is an explanatory account of morality, both metaphysical and semantic. So we want to know what is morality, and also what do we do when we speak about morality, and positing that our epistemic access to moral facts is via our intuitions has already been it's a very odd argument. This argument has been attacked, or it faces a very powerful objection from Mackey, J.L. Mackey, and it's called the argument from queerness. I mean, queerness here just means weird or odd, right? And the argument from queerness, it's a composite argument, it's a metaphysical and epistemic and so on. But the relevant part here is the epistemic dimension of the argument from queerness, and it says like, Well, I mean, if you try to explain to me that there is such a thing as morality, but we cannot see it, it's in this mysterious realm that called the non-natural, and we can only know it via this magical or mysterious ability that is called intuition. That we, by the way, we do not know how we do it, or we do not know where is our intuitors, or where in our brain or in our body we can find, we can develop this skill, or we can find this intuition machine. Then it's a very bad, or a very implausible description of of us obtaining moral knowledge, and it's so implausible it must be false, right? So we don't have very good evidence to believe in this scenario. And a lot of people have tried to answer Mackey's objection. So it's not just this hand waving counter objection that I'm trying to do here. Because even if I concede that okay, there is this non-natural realm, we have intuitions, or intuitions are conducive to obtain moral knowledge. There is this further objection that has not been answered by intuitionists, which is like, how am I supposed to know that my intuitions are right? Because you cannot, because they are pre-rational, you cannot adjust it with other intuitions or other beliefs because you cannot assess them. It's just something that happens immediately, right? So A, how am I supposed that my intuitions are correct? How am I supposed even to know that my intuitions are moral? And also, we cannot answer what happens if I have conflicting intuitions. How am I supposed to solve it? So even if I concede intuitionism in the sense of like the non-naturalist view, the objections does not allow you to explain whether whatever we intuit is moral knowledge, right? So it's not a good thing. So from the point of view of the proponent, you say like, well, if you are a non-naturalist, you cannot obtain moral knowledge, or if you do, it's impossible to know whether whatever you obtain is moral knowledge. So an AI cannot do it. So we're in the same boat, right? So AI's decision is as good as yours, right? Because I do not know whether you can actually access to moral knowledge. But if you're a naturalist on the other side, right? This is the other metaethical view in which it claims that morality actually is reducible to empirical facts, to natural facts. In the same way, the natural facts, such as like natural so facts about the temperature or light or a table or whatever kind of objects in the world. Um, in which way we can obtain moral knowledge? Well, if morality is reducible to empirical facts, we can obtain moral knowledge in the same way that we obtain knowledge of anything else in the world, by positing or advancing scientific theories of that thing. So through observation, we can derive certain conclusions, certain knowledge about the thing. And we can do that with morality too. So I don't need to buy the intuition. I don't need to be an intuition machine. I don't need to kind of create all this non-natural realm to defend my view. We can actually do it, and we do it every day, right? Uh, okay, but then the proponent will say, well, if theorizing, if obtaining knowledge about what morality is the same way, we need to do the same things that we do about anything else, which is basically devising proper explanatory frameworks that are able to accommodate a bunch of different things. Well, AI can do that and even better because it has a strongest and more powerful computational capacity. So if your moral knowledge is, if you think that obtaining moral knowledge, or you can only do it in this way, well, AI can perform that action better, right? So AI is in a better stance, or at least in the same stance, or better than humans. So it's not a good argument. Okay. So then we have, for cases of near infallibility, we have the what I call the BBB. This is my before last, so I'm sorry if I'm too slow, but sometimes I just get caught in these things. So the BBB objection is like, immediately they say, well, we have a problem with AI that we do not know how it reasons, right? AI is a black box, right? The reasoning is opaque. We do not know how the system makes decisions, what kind of factors influence their outputs, and why the system produces a specific outputs, right? So even if Hercules and Plato can justify their decisions, we cannot know whether that justification is what actually motivated their reasoning. And this the BBB objection is a two-prong objection. So on the one side you have the black box problem, I do not know what is the justification of the decision. But on the other prong is that, well, and also AI, we know that might be biased. They might be affected by bias. So potential bias might affect augmented justice decisions. A widespread concern regarding the use of AI is that it can be biased by many factors, right? And justice is incompatible with bias. Therefore, if AI is biased, it cannot ensure justice. So if we put together the black box and the bias problems, then we can formulate the BBB objections. And since we cannot know how augmented justice arrived to decisions, because the black box, we cannot rule out that those decisions are potentially the result of biases. If augmented justice cannot rule out biases, then its claim to justice in adjudication is undermined, right? And this is an epistemic argument or objection in the sense that yes, it might be at a general level, augmented justice might be nearly infallible, but we do not have good evidence for each specific decision as to whether it's free of biases, because there is something I cannot escape, which is the black box, right? So I don't have evidence to believe that a specific decision is not being affected by biases because I cannot know, right? Since I cannot know, since I don't have good evidence to believe on the justice of the decision, then maybe we should not use AI. But of course, the counter is obvious, right? Well, humans are also black box, right? That's a problem, right? And humans are also biased. I mean, biases are something that are inherent on our like psychological mechanism, right? And then I go a bit about how to justify or where does the literature already dealt with this idea of black box. Right, so we have a very famous distinction in philosophy of science about the context of discovery and justification. The context of discovery is the black box, right? So that's how we came up with decisions. We do not know. What we only know is the justification. So we kind of, the justification is always exposed to the decision making. And this is something that already was dealt or addressed by the legal realist with the rationalization thesis, right? They say like, well, judges do not follow the law and the facts, and they don't do this major premise, minor premise, conclusion sort of scenario, right? They just decide. Some of them, like Jerome Frank, believe that it's just a hunch. Just decide. It's like an impulse, and then once your decision has been made, you kind of rationalize it. So you dress it as if it was the result of following a specific procedure, and the decision is just the result of that procedure, right? So it's not uncommon, this idea that courts are black boxes or jurors are black boxes for that matter. And also, of course, the bias problem, which is we have tons of literature about judicial biases and juror biases, and right. So you can even say like, well, I mean, AI in itself cannot be affected by biases. It's just the outputs, right, or the inputs. Sorry, but AI is just doesn't have the mental apparatus to foster biases. So it's also a bad justification because if you're saying like, look, because they are biases and it's a black box, we should not have it. You also need to accept that the same goes for human courts, and maybe even worse, right? And then the last objections, and I'm gonna close with this, is that they might say something on the likes like, well, yeah, you might be infallible or nearly infallible. That seems fine. And I think this makes more sense for nearly infallible AIs. Um, that yeah, but if you mess up, you're not AI cannot be held accountable, unlike courts, right? So accountability is a key institutional design of the rule of law and Western legal systems. Courts are made accountable by designing legal mechanisms that can either remove judges from their seats or convict them of special crimes incurred whilst exercising the authority of their office. Plato and Hercules cannot be held accountable. Thus, the legal system will lack a response to counter potential miscarriage of justice. Right? That's why it's better frame it for a nearly infallible AI. So the danger of unaccountable adjudication undermines the rule of law, providing a powerful reason to reject augmented justice. But Yeah, the answers also seems they are not particularly troublesome. I mean, Plato, it seems unclear how Plato can be affected by the accountability objection, because ultimately it's the judge, the human judge, the ones that will sign on the decision, right? So all these legitimacy issues also is not being affected by Plato. Accountability is not affected by Plato. But of course, we can, if we want to defend Hercules, then that's a different deal, right? Since Hercules produces authoritative decisions, you might be worried about this accountability issue in cases of miscarriage of justice, right? But to answer these objections, the proponents need to kind of figure out the first thing is like whether accountability is of the essence of adjudication, right? So, but and the answer is clear. It's not, right? But for centuries we have had non-accountable judges or non-accountable adjudicators, right? Accountability measures are fairly new, right? So it's a contingent situation. So, and if it's a contingent situation, one might say, well, why cannot just devise institutional measures to prevent this, right? Maybe create some sort of human court of appeals or use some other powerful AI. Okay, I don't know how would that work, but the fact that we can actually tackle these accountability issues by creating an institutional framework is reason enough to say, well, accountability is just contingent, right? So you can actually fix it. Um, so just now we need to start thinking. We need to be creative and try to figure out how it works. And insofar we can provide institutional measures, then the accountability danger or it's been reduced or weakened in such a way that it's not particularly a threat for the augmented justice. But did we run out of reasons? And this is kind of the last part, and this is the last remarks of the presentation. I mean, one of the things that these papers try to highlight is that there is something weird about AI and decision making, at least in law and maybe in some other high stakes scenarios, in which even if we remove all the plausible and powerful and commonsensical objections, there's still this worry. And we would like to know what that kind of worry is. And maybe it's just maybe it's not a good reason, right? In the sense of like we cannot produce or justify a proper argument against AI, but it's still something that might shed light on certain relations of what we expect of legal systems, such as this idea of justice. Maybe there is something there that facing a human provides some solace or some sort. There must be a virtue there. I'm a moral anti-realist, so I don't believe in virtues. So I leave it to the moral realist to try to figure this thing out. So thank you very much. I don't know how can I stop sharing. I'm gonna try to stop sharing here. There we go. There.
Ok, muy bien. Pasemos entonces inmediatamente a la ronda de comentarios, en realidad de contraponencia, a cargo de Triantafyllos Gkouvas.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. So, as well, I'm going to be speaking in English, and I will begin with this. Well, I believe in virtues as a virtue ethicist. These are my main moral intuitions, but I'm not going to take this obviously as a starting point because, I mean, there is a way. I mean, there's a whole bunch of research called virtue jurisprudence, that, pivots around the idea that first and foremost, justice is a virtue of institutions. And by proxy, it is also a virtue of the agents that carry out the tasks of the institutions, obviously including the judges and other also institutional actors. But I think that this is, I would more call it like a tradition of thought rather than an actual living powerful objection against the use of AI in law. Okay, so I will bracket this whole tradition of thinking about the role of justice in law, and I will join Sebastian in assuming, okay, that justice, first of all, is a property or an attribute, if you want, of outcomes, right? Again, this is not the only way of theorizing about justice. Even if you don't theorize about justice as a virtue, you could still theorize about justice as a property, for example, of a process, rather than the property of the outcome of the process, and many other views perhaps in the middle. But let us assume, for the sake of the argument, that justice eventually is about outcomes. And let me make it even more precise, that justice is just to be just, or delivering justice or administering justice is about getting things right in a certain way. I mean, that expression in English, getting things right, I think is very close also to this very tight connection that I think quite correctly Sebastian makes between justice as a deontic notion with another notion that is not entirely deontic, it's also dispositional, but it has a deontic component, and it's the notion of fallibility, okay? Because fallibility is about, let's say, being vulnerable to error, and getting things right is making sure that you avoid errors, right? So there seems to be a very tight connection between delivering justice and getting things right in a certain respect. By the way, this is also an idea that was elaborated by Gilbert Ryle when he drew a distinction between what he called process verbs and success verbs, or process terms and success terms. So, for example, when you use the verb to win, right, this is a success term. It's not about the process, right? Whereas when you use a verb like, I don't know, I trying is the process, right? So it seems like that delivering justice, doing justice, rendering justice, I mean, we can choose many terms, is a success verb or a success predicate, if you want, right? So success really matters in this account. And our question then immediately becomes, if success is that what mainly matters about delivering justice, and of course we can further specify the criteria of success, but we have to assume that this is all about one form of success. Is it just legal success? Could it also be moral success? But it's success. If that is the case, then isn't it legitimate to suppose that humans and AI can put, on the scales with respect to how successful they are in delivering the task of rendering justice, right? And I think that in this respect, Sebastian's argument is pretty strong, because it's not that he is, let's say, downplaying the role of the ordinary objections that come from certain positions in metaethics, like moral realism, about the role of intuitions, not just in moral reasoning, but also in legal reasoning. Just to give you, by the way, an example of an intuition, or something that would look like an intuition in legal reasoning. So not a moral intuition, but a legal intuition. I think that's maybe could be part of our discussion later on. That all these exemplar terms in jurisprudence, like recall of Justice Holmes, the bad man or the good man, right? These exemplary figures, or the ordinary person, when we talk about negligence in law, for example, the ordinary, rational, careful person. These are figments, right? Fictions that operate as exemplars that are supposed to guide us in our deliberation about what would be the expected successful result in a process. So these are also I think they operate as intuitions in law in a specifically legal way. So I think that this argument about the role of intuitions in judicial reasoning could apply to them as well. in relation to AI, because AI obviously does not need to rely on intuitions, does not need to rely on figuring out what the exemplary, ordinary, careful person is. Okay. So that being said, I would like to spend a little bit more time in taking seriously also Sebastian's argument about the black box objection, because I think this is perhaps the most critical part of the argument. In which sense? In the sense that it gives us good reason to put at the same level of abstraction the human mind and the artificial mind, or if you don't like the word mind, intelligence, right? So the human mind on the one hand and the artificial intelligence on the other. And why is that? I mean, Sebastian already said it, that the human brain or the human mind, I mean, we can apply both perhaps, is also a black box, right? But that made me think a little bit more about the consequences of thinking, and worrying about, not just thinking, worrying about what is happening inside the black box and what is the problem about the black box. And just to remind you, there's a long, very long and very old at the same time discussion about that uses the black box argument when we are talking about all these mental states that involve our perception or our sensations, or for example, pain. What is pain as a mental state? And there are arguments to the effect that pain as a state or a process, right, in itself as a mental state is a black box, right? And the only thing we have access to is, on the one hand, the realizers of pain, which in the case of most human beings is more or less the stimulation of some form of neurological fibers that are called C fibers. And on the other hand, on the output side, you have the role played by these realizers. And what is the role? It's, for example, to produce the belief in an organism or a body that there's something wrong with my body, and also to produce a desire, an instinctual desire to exit that state of pain, right? So we have the realizers, and on the other hand, the role, which is about the outcome. When you perform the role, this is the outcome. So the outcome is to successfully produce the belief that there's something wrong with the body, and at the same time produce the desire to take steps to exit from that painful state. By analogy, or some analogy, in our case of law, there seems to be a similar scenario where we have the outcome, which is the verdict. It's the judicial decision, which consists in what? Maybe this is where I would add an extra. What is this outcome? Is it the decision? Because the decision, if you think about it, it's a mental act. Or is it the state of affairs that obtains in virtue of that mental act, which we call the judicial decision? I mean, perhaps both. So what would that state of affairs be? Here's my suggestion. It could be something like the allocation of what? Of spheres of this is your problem, this is the other's problem, or this is the court's problem, right? So after the process, as soon as we go through the black box of the judge's mind and we reach the result, a new reality comes up where it so happens that one of the litigants, the plaintiff, the defendant, comes up with carrying out the consequences of the problem of the dispute, and another one becomes liberated or expects to become liberated from the bad consequences of the wrongful act that led them to the court, right? So this is a state of affairs, a little bit complex, but it's more or less the way I would understand the outcome of a judicial procedure. So it's not just the judicial decision per se, but it's also the state of affairs that obtains as a result of, the decision itself. And on the side of the input, we have what also Sebastian has been referring to, all the material of the legal doctrine, practices, rules, past decisions, perhaps. In the case of precedential reasoning, could perhaps pose a challenge. I don't know, Sebastian, about that. I mean, maybe the case of presidential reasoning, how it could be accommodated by AI. Of course, you might say, why not? I mean, AI can also track similarities between cases and apply analogically. So perhaps there's no big difference when we think in presidential terms
This idea of
instead
pattern
of
recognition that already the realists
exactly,
were talking, right? So, which is what they do. Yeah.
exactly. So we have this structure, and then, as I was saying, in the case of pain, we said that we have pain on the apex of the triangle. So we have the input, the output, and the apex of the triangle, and we said that the pain element is the black box, and by analogy, we say that. Here's another question: what is the analog of the pain in the case of what is the actual black box? Of course, we might say it's the human mind. Yes, but even more precisely, it's the judge. But even more precisely, it is a specific type of status, if you like, an institutional status, which we call the judge, right? And this status is occupied by an actual person who has an actual mind, and certain things happen there, right? So I think that if someone wanted to deliver a strong objection against the use of AI, the beginning of an answer or the beginning of an objection could be something like to the following effect: that somehow this thing that we call the status of the judge, is an ineliminable part of the institutional design of a legal system. So it's a constitutive element of a legal system as such. So it's not about the outcome and it's not about the input, it's about the status itself. So far, most arguments about the role of the status are understood either in terms of the outcome or in terms of the input. So there's no strong advocacy in favor of the status itself. I mean, think about, just to remind us again of the legal realists, how they are talking about other concepts that look like status concepts. So, for example, Alfros, ownership, property. I mean, what is to be a proprietor, right? That's also a status. It is, all you need is the input, which is, for example, you are a physical person who is in a specific jurisdiction that happens to have certain things, under their physical command. And on the side of the outcome, the import is that you have certain powers and abilities to do certain things with certain things that you have, and that's all. I mean, there's nothing more to the status itself. I mean, instead of owner, you can call him or her schmoner. It doesn't really matter, right? So by analogy, in the case of artificial intelligence, this reification or adoration or fetishization, perhaps, of the status role, the role of the judge, as an ineliminable agent in the process of delivering justice, it is an argument, but you really need a powerful metaphysics, I think, in order to say that, we really need that. It's not as easy as in the case of property to say, property is just a term of language. And what it really matters is what you can do with the things you have and, where you are as a member of a political community. That's all. Input, output. I mean, property itself, it could be something else. It doesn't really matter. So we need an argument. And so far, to be honest, and even though, as I say, I'm coming from a more virtue theoretic understanding of justice, and virtues, of course, are owned by agents, and agents are those who occupy the status position of the judge. But I have to be honest, I haven't seen any really convincing argument that does not introduce, here's the point, an inflationary metaphysics, a metaphysics that is too demanding, not just of law, but of social ontology more generally, right? That, there is something over and above let's say, the exercise, the performance, or the manifestation of a status, and the elements that make up the possessor of a status, the input. So as long as that remains an open question, I think that Sebastian's thought experiment, it is a thought experiment, it's a very idealized one, by the way, because maybe we'll never reach the point of ascribing near infallibility to artificial intelligence. I'm not quite sure about that. Who knows? Who knows? I don't know. But working within the contours of that thought experiment, I think that we have very good reasons to assume we have two options, I think. One, which I'm not going to go for, is the option of suspending judgment, to say, well, I don't know yet. Let's see how things go, right? The other one is the option of humility, which is to say, well, I mean, come on, it's obvious things are getting in this direction, okay? In lack of a better argument, let's try things out. Okay, let's see how it goes. Let's see, for example, if at the societal level there is a significant reduction in institutional trust on the side of citizens with respect to the use of AI, because we're also going to have to take into account these, extrajudicial parameters, right, in eventually delivering a final verdict on the usefulness of AI in judicial lawmaking. It's not just about adjudication, it's also about the societal framework within which adjudication is embedded. But I think that we can engage in this, not anymore thought experiment. This is going to be a practice from now on. As long as we're using AI, it's not in thought experiments anymore. We can engage in that with the essential of epistemic humility, okay? Not a suspension of judgment, and see how it goes step by step. I think this kind of incrementalism in our approach is the only way of going about that could really give us, if not answers, it could afford us, let me put it this way, and with that I finish, it could afford us the time we need as legal philosophers, because we need some time for that, the time we need to fill in certain gaps. Because, and why do I say that? Because we don't have the full picture yet. No, we don't. We don't have it either with respect to, the advancements in AI and all its possible uses, nor in terms of its repercussions, societal repercussions. And also, that's another part, no, not in terms of how the use of AI in adjudication could affect relations between different branches of government, right? Because it's not just about adjudication anymore. I mean, think about the use of AI in the constitutional review of legislation, for example. So cases that go beyond the delivery of civil justice or the delivery of criminal justice and go way into delivering constitutional justice as well, right? So with that, I'd like to thank you all. Thank you so much, Sebastian. I really enjoy that, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tria.
Bien, con eso hemos terminado ponencia y contraponencia. Abrimos entonces la discusión bilingüe o trilingüe en el